All right, then let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Boston Society of Architects Green Roof and Infrastructure Team Knowledge Community and virtual session. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Erik Hegre, and I'm one of the Knowledge Community co-chairs along with Gary Brock. There we go. We have a great program lined up today, but before we jump in with more introductions, I wanted to start off with a brief overview of GRIT, followed by some organizational information before passing the baton to Gary and Nicole to talk more about the session today. So as a brief introduction, this group was founded last year after the Greater Green Conference, hosted and organized by Green Roofs for Healthy Cities and members of the GRIT community who are here today. We wanted to keep the dialogue going here in the greater Boston region. There'll be a link in the chat to the organization Green Roofs for Healthy Cities. That will be coming in a little bit. But the mission for this group is to promote understanding the importance and value of green roofs, vegetated wall systems, and other green infrastructure, GI, in mitigating climate change through a diverse group and community members, builders, designers, engineers, policymakers, manufacturers, the list goes on. The group was formed with the goal to support education, policies, and regulations that are favorable to green roofs and green infrastructure. And I think the topic today is apropos, particularly as we are getting news reports from the effects of the hurricane in the communities down south. And so it felt remiss not mentioning that today before we get started. Just so we're thinking about those communities and what they're going through. Also wanted to mention one of the programs that we've initiated over the course of the summer and hoping to conclude later this year is a case study program that we're hoping will pull together examples of green infrastructure in the Boston area. Currently, we're looking at about 10 to 12 projects, ranging from buildings to landscape to civil projects, and the hope that we can publish these case studies and they can be an instrumental tool, resource for the community, but also for policymaking and education. With that, if you'd like to participate or if that sounds interesting, please reach out to Gary or me and we can discuss some next steps. If we have time at the end of the program, we would like to show you a few of the case studies that are in development at the moment, just to kind of show you what's going on, and then we can elaborate if we have some extra time. At this point, I'd like to hand things over to Gary to introduce our guest, Nicole, and provide an overview of the speaker series that we have been working on in the background for this fall. Gary, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Erik.
Yeah.
So as Erik mentioned, we're trying to line up some presentations for our meetings in the future. So when you go to the webpage at the BSA architects.org and go to our knowledge community, you'll see what we've got listed there. So October 30th, we have Kate England, the Director of Green Infrastructure for the City of Boston. We'll be talking about what their efforts are and how broadly they're trying to incorporate green infrastructure design and planning in the city. And in November, folks from my office and the landscape architect, we hope, and the head of the school for Josiah Quincy Upper School, a new school that's been completed in Chinatown, will come in to talk about the green roof there, because that's a urban location without any site. So we took advantage of the rooftop for their program and some of the environmental benefits related to that. And that's November 20th right now, but we're trying to get the head of the school, so that date could change. So keep an eye on the website in case we have to adjust that. And then we're still looking at December and out into the future. We're always thinking about ways that we might do some tours of some green roof or green infrastructure, maybe later in the spring. So if there are some that you're connected to or some that you're interested in, let us know about it. The more people involved in this and the broader knowledge that we can gain ourselves and share, the better. And today we're going to have Nicole, who's, as Erik had mentioned, been involved with the Greater Green Conference and has been involved with City of Boston and their green infrastructure efforts. And she's got a great presentation for us to talk about things from a civil engineering point of view, dealing with these large amounts of water that we don't always, fully understand and grasp. So at this point, I'll let Nicole take over.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erik and Gary, and I'm glad to be here. Gary or Erik, if as I'm sharing my screen, if anyone else comes into the waiting room, would you be able to admit them?
I was just going to mention that. Yep, I'm on it.
Thank you. All right. Is everyone seeing a slide deck?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. As I mentioned, my name is Nicole Holmes. I'm the Sustainability and Innovation Practice Lead at Niche Engineering, and I'm seeing some familiar faces in the participant list here that I know we've worked with in the past. But technically, my my primary focus really has been on stormwater planning, green infrastructure planning, and resilient stormwater management. So I have kind of compiled a little bit of a medley here to kind of serve as this kickoff to our series. I was planning to start with just kind of an overview of green infrastructure and its benefits, and I'm likely preaching to the choir there. But I did want to provide you with some resources that have been developed specifically for Boston and for our area that will be hopefully useful to you. And I was also going to kind of talk a little bit more about some of the key drivers for green infrastructure implementation in Boston. We definitely have a unique climate, a unique, condition here in Boston, and I would say even, technically the greater Boston area than other regions of the country. So I wanted to just kind of tie it a little bit to what we're thinking about locally and how green infrastructure can help. And talk a little bit about some barriers and challenges. And this is actually coming from specifically the presentation I gave at the Greater Green Conference, mostly focusing on green roofs. But I really think it's an important discussion, and hopefully we can continue as we all, jump into the Q&A session, talking about some of the barriers and challenges to green infrastructure implementation, particularly around green roofs. And then just some closing thoughts about the future of green infrastructure and resilient stormwater. So I pulled, this definition of green infrastructure actually from the EPA, from the Clean Water Act. And really what we're talking about are these measures, using plants in soil systems or permeable pavement or stormwater harvesting. And we're really just finding ways to store, infiltrate, and evapotranspire stormwater very close to where it falls, and obviously in an effort to reduce flows to sewer systems and surface water. So, that is a narrow definition as it's coming from the Clean Water Act, with only the mind of what green infrastructure can do for managing stormwater. But we all know that, not only is green infrastructure very, can be a cost-effective approach to managing stormwater, it also provides many community benefits. And we're really trying to kind of, through this group, find ways to think about that triple bottom line and help leverage all of the benefits, environmental, social, and economic, to help leverage the use of more green infrastructure, more widespread green infrastructure. I like to kind of give this, this definition of this contrast of the way stormwater had been traditionally managed versus the way we're thinking about managing stormwater today. And really, kind of green versus gray infrastructure. We're sort of talking about, kind of managing stormwater either at the source versus end of pipe. So traditionally, catch basins and piping systems were originally designed to collect water as quickly as possible and get it away from the site as quickly as possible, discharging it to the downstream water body, causing, environmental issues, including water quality and downstream flooding and erosion. We all know that. Green infrastructure actually strives to absorb the water close to where it lands, if not right where it lands, giving it a chance to be taken up by plants, to evaporate, to infiltrate into the ground. And only when those systems have exceeded their capacity would that water overflow to the gray infrastructure systems, the pipes, and, ultimately discharging to our water bodies. So this is sort of just a cutaway. Let me just get this up my way. A cutaway of what that, what we're talking about here, collecting water straight from the roof drain, straight from, pavements and parking lots, and, discharging it to the local water body, versus considering green roofs for rooftops or rainwater harvesting for rooftops. Basically draining water from paths and walkways to adjacent depressed landscape areas using permeable pavements. And so you can kind of see all these arrows that we're starting to think about, all the ways in which we're trying to absorb water, get it into the ground, get it back into the atmosphere. And again, only when those systems have exceeded their capacity would we be considering overflowing the water. So really this approach is going to take some time, but at some point in time, if we could picture an ideal world where everything was green infrastructure, all of that gray infrastructure that is currently completely under capacity for today's events, we could start to think about that as kind of being our, a secondary conveyance. Green infrastructure is the first priority, and the gray infrastructure can kind of become a secondary method. And really the difference is that where, you walk around, you see a lot of landscapes really barricaded by curbing, or the, landscapes are, instead of being depressed, are, elevated. So we're starting to think about ways that we can certainly integrate stormwater and landscape as much as possible. And then I mentioned this originally, and as I talked about some of the co-benefits beyond stormwater benefits, we know stormwater quality can be improved. Volume is reduced because we are infiltrating more water into the ground, and in some cases evaporating and reusing that water instead of allowing it to run off. And we are reducing peak flows because green infrastructure can absorb and significantly slow down water contributing to the storm drain system. But there's many co-benefits. Some of them are, measurable, like, carbon sequestration and, heat island and improved air quality. And some are, qualitative, including like, improved quality of life. And there's definitely many studies that talk about, the benefits of, having more green infrastructure and trees in a neighborhood in terms of things like increased property value. So, here's just a sampling of some of the types of, successful green infrastructure installations, or in resilient stormwater installations. I think pretty much all that, yes, that I have worked on and that my firm has worked on, and hopefully in collaboration with some of you, but certainly looking at bioretention practices, an innovative water quality treatment system at Croon Hall. I'm showing some permeable pavements here. And even, a lot of these things, there's kind of a thought that it costs a lot of money to do these things, but that picture on the top right at Stonehill College is a very effective strategy. It just, it's low tech, low cost, and low maintenance, and that's exactly what they wanted, but it's highly effective. Constructed wetlands, tree filters, and green roofs. And we're also looking at some very large scale systems on campuses, including the system you see here at Princeton University, where we actually integrated a large scale stormwater system with a new geothermal system beneath a soccer stadium. And we worked on that in collaboration with Sasaki and many others. All right, so I'm just going to share quickly a few resources. The first is the Boston Green Infrastructure Handbook, and you can find this actually on Boston Water and Sewer Commission's website, as well as the City of Boston's Green Infrastructure page, so you can kind of get to it either way. And this was developed, I think, 2 years ago, really as a way to kind of help start to coordinate green infrastructure planning and design in the City of Boston. So there's 4 chapters, and hopefully they can all be useful. It sort of starts out with a very high level introduction, a lot of the things we just talked about in terms of an overview of green infrastructure and its benefits. It then kind of gets into more about why, you know, green infrastructure is so important in Boston. But really the meat of it is in chapters 3 and 4, where there's some design guidelines and a toolkit that includes details and all kinds of information that hopefully will be helpful as you all design these systems moving forward. So we sort of went through this, you know, the chapter 1 is the introduction of those benefits and co-benefits. Chapter 2, I'm going to get into this a little more detail today, really the Boston context and, you know, 6 of the key drivers for green infrastructure implementation in Boston. The design guidelines have a number of matrices, you know, that should be useful to you, including suitability matrix, performance matrices. There's a lot of technical design considerations and some initial thoughts about O&M and some recommendations for system sizing, particularly in Boston, in terms of how Boston Water and Sewer Commission is currently reviewing stormwater designs and how green infrastructure can fit into that. And then finally, here's just a few screenshots of what that toolkit looks like. There's some illustrative images and some details. The details have been coordinated with Boston Water and Sewer Commission and Public Works and others in the city, for example. So kind of moving forward, these could be helpful starts to get going on some of your design of systems. And a supplement to that, which was just released within the past few months, is sort of the sister document to the Green Infrastructure Handbook, is the O&M Handbook. So this is similarly arranged in 4 chapters, starting with, you know, kind of an introduction and the context, but really getting into the types of inspection and maintenance actions that are necessary for green infrastructure. And that includes everything from kind of more mechanical treatments for pre-treatment devices and such, to more landscape maintenance activities that, you know, obviously associated with the vegetation and some of the other components of green infrastructure. And there's also some useful checklists in the back of the book that could potentially be helpful to you. We'll probably talk about this in our discussion. One of the main barriers for green infrastructure, or the success of green infrastructure post-construction, definitely has seems to be centered around O&M, and, you know, whether it's the capabilities, whether it's funding issues, you know, that is one of the major issues that we see locally and around the country. So hopefully, you know, this can be one step in helping with that coordination process. Just kind of scrolling through here. These are some of the matrices that define the types of actions that are necessary to inspect and maintain green infrastructure solutions. So as you're considering green infrastructure on projects, this could be a useful tool to even have those initial conversations with the owners, you know, so that you can understand whether they would have the capabilities and the funding to maintain green infrastructure. It's very, very important to, you know, to ensure the success. And then finally, there are a few other resources in the city of Boston. You can link to these also from the city of Boston's green infrastructure page. Boston Parks and Rec developed a green stormwater infrastructure design and implementation guide. That's also highly illustrative and a great tool. And the Boston Complete Streets Design Guidelines, although it's focused on transportation safety, there are certainly a lot of recommended opportunities for integrating green infrastructure into city streets. All right, time check. So I'm going to kind of talk about the kind of 6 key drivers for green infrastructure in Boston. I'm sure there are more. But these seem to stand out as, you know, really answering the question why. So we know that Boston area water bodies are impaired, and they're primarily impaired for a number of pollutants. The pollutant of the major concern is phosphorus. and phosphorus in the Charles River, the Ponset River, Mystic River, and ultimately Boston Harbor has led to some algal blooms and other water quality issues that have prohibited, safe swimming and activities in the water bodies. So certainly water quality is a huge issue, and the wet weather discharge of stormwater has been attributed as one of the major reasons for that phosphorus impairment. So the way green infrastructure can help is that, as we discussed, green infrastructure has a really high capacity for filtering and infiltrating nutrients, as well as other pollutants that are found in stormwater runoff. More traditionally, if we go back, a decade or two, when we were focused mostly on detaining stormwater and maybe using manufactured treatment devices that just settle out trash and debris, those are slightly effective, but they're actually not highly effective for addressing nutrients because there's both soluble nutrients as well as nutrients that adhere to the particles. So you can only remove the nutrients that are adhered to particles if you're settling. But filtration and infiltration techniques can get extremely high performance on removing nutrients, including phosphorus and nitrogen. So obviously, the city of Boston and Boston Water and Sewer Commission are very focused on water quality impairment. The Boston Water and Sewer Commission is needing to meet the conditions of a consent decree with the EPA and the DEP to take action and to clean the water bodies. So there's certainly need to take on a multi-pronged approach, and green infrastructure is one of the multiple actions that they need to take to address that issue. Very timely, as Erik mentioned, with the catastrophic flooding that we're seeing in other regions of the country. Boston is also highly at risk for coastal and inland flooding. So this is focusing specifically on inland flooding. We know that we're seeing more and more extreme precipitation events. The capacity of our infrastructure is completely not adequate to be able to withstand the amount of precipitation that it's trying to convey. And it's leading to more and more instances of inland flooding. So green infrastructure, is part of the solution. It's not the solution, but we're certainly looking for ways to actually optimize and even increase the capacity and the retention capacity and detention capacity of green infrastructure even more, than the norm, which is typically to kind of try to retain about an inch or so, all in an effort to start to think about how we can help alleviate those overtaxed storm drain systems. In Boston specifically, we're, concerned about sea level rise. That will, not only continue to, trouble the development and redevelopment in the city, but it will continue to kind of exacerbate the coastal and inland flooding conditions. When some of these, when we have sea level rise and we pile on top of that a coastal event, we have to realize that almost all of the outfalls from all of the inland drainage systems are trying to drain to the harbor or the rivers that are completely flooded as well. So it pushes back and back and back the amount of flooding that we'll see. So we definitely need to find places to temporarily store water while we wait for water to recede, and green infrastructure can be one of those strategies. It's also a strategy that's currently being coupled with a lot of the coastal flood mitigation strategies that are being planned along the harbor, as well as, like you can see the photo on the bottom right here, is some great example of the work being done at Moakley Park in collaboration with STAS. This is one that's actually very unique to Boston, and this is groundwater recharge as one of the key issues, particularly in the Back Bay. Boston has a zoning district, which is called the Groundwater Conservation Overlay District. And in that area, we find most of our historic buildings, and the historic buildings in the Back Bay, for example, were seeing that as the groundwater over time was depleting because of impervious surfaces and the lack of groundwater recharge, those piles were subject to rotting, and many of the historic buildings in those areas were at risk of structural failure or issues because of that. So getting groundwater actually into the ground has been something that Boston has been doing for a few decades now in that area of the city. And what green infrastructure can continue to do is to help to direct stormwater from impervious surfaces into the ground to help sort of replenish at least those shallow aquifers that have been depleted over time. So this is something that's very unique, but you can, when you see maps of green infrastructure and infiltration installations across the city, you will definitely notice a very, very heavy presence of them in those zones. And it's because of that regulation in the GCOD, where at least managing an inch or more has been required for all development, as I mentioned, for quite some time. And then finally, we're kind of getting into some of the co-benefits here, but urban heat island is a major issue in our city and many others. And so anytime we can help reduce impervious surfaces, shade impervious surfaces, we are kind of helping with that issue. It's a huge priority here in the city of Boston, and kind of coupling all of these green infrastructure projects are certainly obviously checking the box on our water quality issues and all of the other issues we described so far, as well as helping to reduce urban heat island. And I think there's just a lot of other opportunities for integrating green infrastructure in collaboration with many of the other initiatives that are happening here, including obviously everything associated with Climate Ready Boston, but also these improvements to our transportation network are definitely opportunities with traffic calming. We're finding a lot of ways to integrate, for example, bioretention curb extensions at certain key crossings where BTD or Public Works are actually looking to, implement safety improvements. So we're seeing a lot of success there, and we're definitely seeing that green infrastructure can kind of help support and enhance some of those habitat and transportation corridors that are being improved at present. And, obviously just some other hot button issues that we've, sort of talked about here, but we're just seeing more and more issues with stream degradation, aging and failing infrastructure. And in parts of Boston and Cambridge and in other cities around the country, they still have combined sewers. So when excess stormwater is contributing to those sewers, they do tend to still overflow during major storm events. And so green infrastructure is something that can kind of help to reduce stormwater flows and the timing of stormwater discharge to combined sewers to help reduce combined sewer overflows. And I'm not going to really get into this, but, of course, more and more regulations are sort of catching up. Little by little, it's happening both at the federal level, the state level, the municipal level. Here in Boston, we have some requirements. Redevelopment projects are required to manage stormwater. There isn't currently a mandate to do so with green infrastructure. There is certainly a push to do so with infiltrative techniques. So they're highly effective, but, much of Boston's stormwater management tends to be hidden and underground. And I think it's something that I personally and this whole group is advocating for more visible green infrastructure in the form of green roofs and bioretention, some of the other measures that we talked about here. So large projects are certainly needing to kind of go through this exercise of talking about how they will be meeting the standards, how they will be addressing coastal flood risk, inland flood risk, and the like as they move through the permitting process. And the state of Massachusetts is also in the process of updating their DEP Wetland Protection Act and the Stormwater Management Handbook. And finally, there is more of a mandate for moving forward with green infrastructure. So I think we're going to see, more and more from the regulatory side that this is coming. So far, where we have seen the most implementation of green infrastructure is where it has been more voluntary, in terms of projects setting their own aspirational goals, aligning with LEED or ASLA sites or Living Building Challenge and others, and really kind of pushing the benchmark of, what is required, which tends to be very backward looking, and tends to be based on, historic rainfall events. We're wanting to look towards the future and designing our systems to consider the future, that we're beginning to, have more and more projections for what those more intense events might be. We have more capabilities with modeling, that we can actually model some of these extreme storms and see how our sites could react to that. So there's lots changing, and, a lot of opportunities more moving forward. I'm going to jump quick, and then I want to just, within the next 10 minutes, we want to definitely kind of go into our, conversation. But as I mentioned, I brought forward a few talking points that I had pulled together for the Green to Gray conference, which was the Green Roof for Healthy Cities conference. I think it was last year. And I was asked to kind of talk about, from a civil engineer's perspective, what I saw as some of the barriers to implementing green roofs. And I think some of these apply to ground-based green infrastructure, but more so green roofs. And the first, issue I saw was that we have sort of siloed design team roles and responsibilities. And one of the greatest benefits of green roofs is actually managing stormwater. There's obviously many, many others, but from a regulatory perspective, that is one of the measurable benefits that you would potentially want to take credit for on a green roof. So one challenge that I had seen on some projects that may not be utilizing an integrated design process was that, there were a lot of conversations going on about green roofs and about whether a green roof should be or should not be, or, is a benefit to the project. But none of that scope technically is shown on the civil engineering drawings. So if they are not aware that those discussions are happening, they may just be in isolation, designing a stormwater management system that meets regulations, that meets the goals of the project, sort of in isolation. So then you're sort of double dipping when it comes to thinking about the cost of the green roof. And, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to sort of coordinate those. So really the long and the short is that to have a successful green roof, we need a collaborative and cohesive design team, including the civil engineer. I mean, this does happen on most projects now. I'd say that comment is a little aged at this point. One thing we've also seen is that green roofs tend to, get on the chopping block quite often, and I'm sure you've all experienced that same issue. And the reason being is that what ends up happening sometimes is that if the green roof is not necessarily locked in on a particular project, the civil engineer then is being asked by their client to go ahead and design a full stormwater system on the site. And so then when it comes back to saying, when I suppose you give the owner or the client the opportunity to compare the cost of a green roof to maybe some lower tech solutions that are, on the ground, it sort of gives them a little bit of it doesn't help the cause at all. And that's something that we've definitely seen. So we like to be sure that when that conversation happens and someone tries to compare the cost of a green roof to, say, an underground infiltration system on the site, that is not an apples to apples comparison. The infiltration system on the site is only managing stormwater. It is not providing all of the other benefits of the green roof. So, that is something I definitely caution when that comes forward, that you definitely need a true cost benefit analysis to be able to make that decision with your client. And by the way, the beautiful Harvard Science and Engineering Complex that was Erik's project was an example of a project that did not have these issues. Just wanted to bring that up. So policies and incentives are coming forward a little bit more that we can see. For example, the city of Cambridge actually has a green roof policy that has certainly helped move the benchmark on adding more and more green roofs in the city of Cambridge. But really, there just needs to be, in my opinion, more incentives, more policies for green roofs. And obviously more study about the benefits of combining systems such as green roofs and solar. I feel like I hear so much that we're talking about two competing interests, but we actually had a speaker last year who, brought forward so many examples, particularly from Europe, where green roofs and solar coexisting can actually be more performative for both goals, for both the energy goals and the stormwater goals. So that was really interesting to see. And I think I touched on this a little bit, but one thing I see, another barrier to green roofs, is really just the timing of the permitting process. A lot of times for very complicated projects, permitting has to begin very early. And in some cases, the building team, the architects and MEP and others, may only be around 50% DD, or maybe, trending towards 100% DD. And they may not have made the decision as to whether the green roof is in or out. So unfortunately, we as civil engineers may be asked to get the permits with a design that handles all stormwater on site. And at that point, it becomes, well, I don't need the green roof anymore for stormwater. So, it sort of gives another way that I've seen a green roof kind of hit the chopping block when that timing becomes an issue. I'm not sure how to overcome that timing, besides kind of maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, kind of locking in the goals of the project early, and, ensuring that the integrated design process is happening is one way to help with that barrier. And I talked a little bit more about this in the conference, really about kind of modeling tools for green roofs, or a little bit limited. A lot of stormwater modeling is really based on thinking about how water interacts with the ground and through soils. And so there has been, a lot of ways in which we're learning how to, adapt our modeling tools to properly manage a green roof. But most of the guidance coming from regulations is very, very conservative. So a lot of times we're not allowed to take credit for all the good work that a green roof is doing. So it's something that we're actually internally at Niche Engineering doing some research and working with some different green roof vendors to kind of help push that a little bit further. So I want to jump into our discussion in a moment, and I just had some kind of closing thoughts about kind of moving forward, what we're seeing. We're definitely seeing regulations kind of finally catch up to the sort of thinking about climate change and thinking about needing to think about stormwater more holistically. Mass DEP regulations should be updated. We're seeing in other states such as New Jersey, there's actually a mandate for managing stormwater using green infrastructure. So you are no longer without a waiver or variance allowed to manage stormwater with conventional systems such as detention-based systems. We talked a lot about this, and we can get into this a little bit more. Just the need for, with these systems being more integrated amongst many different disciplines, the success is going to, rely a lot on this stakeholder engagement and integrated design process. I talked a little bit about O&M being an issue. A lot of the green infrastructure case studies that, some folks may hear about are actually bad stories that, this thing looked beautiful when we first built it, but now it looks terrible. No one can maintain it, or we don't have the funding to maintain it. So that's certainly something that I know the city of Boston is working very hard to kind of ensure that green infrastructure built in the city is properly maintained. So we'll see more of that moving forward. And really, finally, as I mentioned, a lot of green infrastructure has traditionally been thought of as a tool only to manage small storms. And that is definitely where it is most beneficial for absorbing the first inch or so, evaporating the first inch or so, infiltrating the first inch or so. But we're really looking for ways that we can further optimize and perhaps stack different strategies so that we can leverage both the benefits of the green infrastructure as well as the need for storing more water during some of these major events. So for example, we're looking at ways that we can stack a bioretention system and, basically expand the storage reservoir below to hold more water, to function better in the large storms. Same thing for permeable pavement, same thing for green roofs. And I think I talked most about these, just really thinking about, starting to think outside the box and thinking about how green infrastructure can be leveraged at a small scale, but also given some of the, large scale watershed wide issues, we're starting to think about ways in which we can think about stormwater, at a neighborhood or a watershed scale, thinking about opportunities, more endpoint strategies, as well as, integrating stormwater with buildings, particularly with green roofs and rainwater harvesting. And I think I talked a little bit more about that. And, at this point, we're sort of, in some cases, kind of struggling with the vulnerability of our existing assets. And then, thinking about the difference when we are doing new development. So we're wanting to think about proactive approaches. When we are redeveloping, we're not only thinking about the type of events we have today, we're forecasting and we're modeling future events so that we can be sure to design sites today that are more resilient to the changing climate. All the while, in some cases, we're literally needing to armor existing buildings and, other assets that are vulnerable to flooding because of, past development practices and aging infrastructure and all the other things that we talked about today. So I think there's a lot of opportunities moving forward, and we can talk more about those now. Erik and Gary are going to jump back in with me here.
That's great, Nicole. Thank you. I think we will open it up for others that might have questions. If you want to raise your hand, we can kind of pick you. Or if you just want to jump in, feel free to jump in unless we start getting too many people talking over each other.
I might jump in for a second while
Sure.
folks are developing their questions. If I go back, for instance, Nicole, to your list, the barriers list, there's a few things that kind of pop out for me that I think are, I represent maybe a group of architects, and we've got a large list of representation on our call today. But maybe as a kind of an awareness, I feel like what's really important in the integrated design process and kind of bringing everybody to the table at the beginning is kind of, maybe in the case of buildings, is coming up with a kind of water budget, a back of the napkin. There are so many tools that I think, from a civil engineer, that you're obligated either by code or by different regulations to follow. And then the plumbers, let's say, for instance, have another set of ways that they need to calculate things. And it gets really complicated really fast, which is why you need, to have everybody at the table at the beginning. But what I also stress is that, you can also like almost overly simplify the equation to where is water coming from and where is it going. And I'll throw something up on the screen for instance, just to kind of illustrate that. Because I think from my perspective as an architect, I don't necessarily know and understand the nuances of all those equations or actually how to solve them. But what I do know how to do is kind of like sketch out a process or a systems kind of diagram and understand that, water is, if I'm thinking about water use, for instance, I know we need to bring it into the building, and I know that it usually needs to do something in the building for somebody or for something. And then, there's usually something that goes away and it either evaporates or goes out of pipe. So in some complicated buildings, I would say complicated because there's so many of those factors, there are a lot of different opportunities within that, kind of back of napkin sketches to realize that an input over here might be an output here, or an output here might actually come back and be an input there. So I think as an architect and as the role of an architect on projects, we may need to play that role of kind of bringing the team together in a way to look at and plug into the opportunities that exist within, a program or a project. And on a very, maybe on a simpler scale, there might be less ins and outs. On a complicated scale, and this is the diagram that we did, for that Harvard project that Nicole mentioned, where we looked at where things were going and what was happening. And maybe one thing to point out, and this doesn't have really anything to do with water, for instance, but it has to do with energy. Is when in the summertime we're making so much condensate water that typically will just go down the drain and into the stormwater system. But if we're doing kind of on an energy side, indirect evaporative cooling, which is a way of kind of a heat recovery, there's like a one-to-one demand source there. And so that's just like a small example of some of the other opportunities at kind of like the back of the napkin level that I think we can do with some of our, at least like on the architectural projects, but I think it relates to a lot of different types of projects as well. I'll just throw that out there.
Absolutely. No, I agree. That was, I mean, that is just such a great example that happened so early on and in such an integrated way between, you know, what, 4 or 5 different disciplines that it really helped. Everybody had a detailed understanding of, you know, the goals and the issues and, you know, the what's possible, what's not, really just the scale of the problem and the scale of the needs that it, you know, it ultimately led to, you know, confirmation that yes, this project needs a green roof. And yes, we were thinking about water as one type of system and all the reuse that went into there. So I think that is an amazing case study for what, you know, that overcame all those barriers, particularly with the process.
I think it also demonstrates the complexity of all this stuff. So it's really kind of hard to sometimes get some teams, you know, all the consultants on board with it. You know, sometimes one consultant not buying into what this can be can kind of derail the whole thing. Yeah. You know, the effort to reuse stormwater and or condensate is great, and it can potentially help with stormwater management. But some, you know, civil engineers might say that we're just going to plan for that storage to be full and not really think of it as anything that would help with stormwater management, because you've just collected it and that could be there from 2 weeks ago and it's full. You haven't used it. So it's hard to kind of get beyond some of those hurdles. So it's great to hear about projects that can do it. I think we're trying to understand how to better figure that out and model that.
Yeah, for me, like the green infrastructure is such a multidisciplinary kind of solution and practice and kind of activity that you have to have a multidisciplinary team to plug in, because it can be so specialized and it touches so many different things. I actually, that's the part I love about it, because it makes it way more interesting than any kind of, you know, single mind frame or single kind of design exercise could yield by itself.
Yeah, same. And I just think, you know, traditionally it has sort of, there's a lot of other priorities that sometimes happen on the project. You know, sometimes it's literally like programming and massing, but from that very, very onset with the massing studies is where you need to start also thinking about stormwater and how stormwater might fit on a tight site. And so in some cases, you know, we're always advocating for getting involved as quickly as possible so we can have those conversations and start talking about integrated systems as early as possible. You know, in the past, and just the way some project goes, unfortunately, it's kind of like, oh, well, whatever, we're going to do all this stuff. And then, you know, the civil can figure out how to manage stormwater. It's kind of like someone else's problem. And that is where we, you know, end up having to come up with a non-integrated solution, you know, that most likely does not include green infrastructure and everything else, you know. So I think obviously the client factors into it for sure. You know, some clients don't really have the appetite for, like, especially like a turnkey type developer, you know, they might not want to have all the bells and whistles unless they can see how it's going to save them money up front. Some of the clients, like Harvard in the photograph you show, have vested forever interest in the property. So, you know, their goals might be a little different, but I think there are still small scale interventions that any project can move forward with.
Yeah, this kind of gets into where policy is important, have an impact, and break us out of the project site mentality of solutions. You know, they're important to do per project, but when you're talking about water, the scale of it is so huge that it really is going to take some policy to kind of get people to be kind of making the effort to do as much as they can.
Yeah.
And I
Nicole,
think
could you talk?
yeah.
I was just
Laura?
going to get kind of following up on what you were getting at, I think, Erik. Nicole, you talked a little bit about some of the, I think, research that Niche is doing to better understand stormwater absorption and what is, what in order to help shape future policy, so it's not quite so conservative. Can you just talk a little bit more? I hope I'm saying that correct.
Yeah, the events, stormwater regulations tend to be based on design storms. Oops, I'm getting a little feedback. Design storms where they are typically 24-hour based storms. You might have hear someone say a 2-year and a 10-year and a 100-year event. So for example, with a 100-year event, we might be talking about like a 7-inch event over 24 hours, something to that effect. So we're, required to design systems to those. We will never get an actual storm that literally simulates exactly what we're being required to design to. And I think that's what we're seeing as one of the major issues. So we've been actually modeling events that have happened, events that we have seen flooding happen in Boston. We've been, using different tools to project more intense and extreme events, whether they're quick thunderstorm events that generate just a massive amount of water, to long duration storms like some of the hurricanes that have just kind of spun around. And we're seeing a number of issues. For example, even just the simplest, the grates that might be designed on roadways might no longer be of adequate capacity to accept the intensity of water, even just trying to enter them. Let alone the fact that, the pipe networks were designed for like a 10-year storm that no longer even exists. The fact that we're being asked to only size green infrastructure for 1 inch. Well, what about when we get 8 inches? So, there's a lot of different standards. And as Erik mentioned, the plumbing engineers are designing to a different standard. So there's all of these kind of artificial design standards that we're sizing these systems to that never actually happen. So we're trying to internally do research to simulate more storms, to look at all aspects, everything from the conveyance to the, inlets to green infrastructure, and looking at how they truly perform and how we can kind of help take a look at that on, other projects and, help, I guess, illustrate to our clients that, hey, you know what, like, this is not, everything works under the design standards we're being asked to design for today. But if we model based on these assumptions, there could be a problem, so I think we do need to be honest and do the best we can with the information we have available to start, taking a look beyond the box and beyond what we're required to by code, knowing that these things are changing so rapidly, that it's actually happening already. Those future projections are already happening, and yet we're not being required to design for them. So there's definitely a disconnect there.
So do you think green roofs will, potential for green roofs, that kind of research that's saying, hey, wait a minute, here's the reality we have to deal with, will make green roofs more important? Or
I do.
well, really
I do. Because a lot of the green roof technologies, and most of the vendors have more robust green roofs, way above and beyond kind of what a tray system can do, with different kinds of lightweight media that really kind of leverage the whole kind of detention/retention area. So, a lot of the green roof technologies are really kind of adapting more towards being like more of a blue roof too. So you're getting, you certainly have the soil you need and so on to grow the plants that you need, but really there's a workhorse below that for stormwater management, where you can retain inches upon inches of water on a green roof, not just one. You can retain, we worked on a project at Princeton where we had a roof that could retain 6.2 inches, and slowly release some of it, evaporate quite a bit, yet the regulators only allowed us to take credit for 1.25 inches. So that was too bad, you know, but however, what we are doing in collaboration with Princeton and Princeton researchers is they are monitoring that green roof. So once we monitor for a year, they're hoping to informally kind of get back together with New Jersey DEP, show them the research, and help to educate them on the fact that, you know, this is managing more than the 1.25 inches you let us take credit for. So hopefully over time, things can change, but I think we need more, you know, Princetons and Harvards that will be willing to test these technologies, monitor the performance, and kind of bring it back forward to help, you know, influence some change.
Hey, Nicole, it's Pete.
Hi, Pete.
Can you hear me?
Oh, good. How you doing?
Good. I'm thinking a lot about what you're talking about here with this sort of Q&A, and it sounds like a lot of what we're pointing to is the need for redundancy above and beyond requirements, regulations, standards that we have in place already. And, you know, there's always a challenge there when you have a bare minimum, a baseline that is certainly more cost effective than sort of building redundancy into our systems. And I'm curious, from your experience, I know you've worked in a lot of municipalities, a lot of cities, thinking about like creating a narrative from a civil engineering and a stormwater management or stormwater engineering perspective versus policy, or sort of places where policy and there's a strong emphasis on the civil engineers pushing for redundant systems. You know, sort of like, what's your ideal situation where we have policy, but we also have sort of strong advocates? And I'm wondering, sort of, given your broad experience, where you're seeing the most successful implementation. You know, maybe the Harvards and the MITs and the Princetons are important, but also thinking sort of beyond these bubble institutions, and sort of like the ideal parameters with which you're able to really push for these redundant broad systems. And I'm using that term redundant not to necessarily say that they're not necessary, but to say they're going above and beyond. And sort of like, what's the most fertile ground that we can kind of think about as a model for pushing for these broader and more redundant systems?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't know if I have all that answer. What I'm seeing is that for simplicity and consistency, a lot of what, you know, the stormwater calculations that are required are very prescriptive. You know, so you're needing to fit into this table and this line, and you're only able to submit calculations in a certain way. And I think that's great because, you know, maybe 80% of the projects coming forward are simple and they might need that. But where I'm seeing the lack is, what about the ones that are going above and beyond? We're not getting any credit for what we're doing above and beyond. We're not, you know, in some cases, not really allowed to submit an alternate compliance approach, or maybe we could, but it's going to lengthen the permitting time. And we're only trying to do good. And yet we're, you know, because we're at risk that there'll be more time for permitting, we're actually risking that project being delayed. So it's like backwards. You know, we're not trying to sneak anything by, yet the projects going above and beyond are getting more, you know, they're being looked at with a magnifying glass because they're just submitting too complicated information. So I think just more partnerships need to happen. And I don't know if anyone else has some great ideas or great examples. Would love to hear them.
Maybe as a quick follow-up, are you thinking, so it sounds like, you know, a very complicated question, but are you thinking that a mixture of performance and prescriptive policy is sort of necessary here, and there needs to be some flexibility around, if there's prescriptive, then there can also be performance, and we need to be able to sort of jump between the two?
Yeah, you know, I do in some cases. I also think, however, some of the regulations too are, you know, the going above and beyond, they don't really care, right? So as long as you meet the minimum standards. So in some cases, we have strategically decided to not let them know about all those extras because, again, at risk that it could complicate the permitting process. So we're only kind of putting forward, here's the minimum requirements. We're going to fill out the tables like you want us to and let it go. But I think that, you know, although that benefited the project, it's not benefiting change. You know, it's not pushing the envelope for these hybrid systems that we are going to need in the future. So, you know, hopefully that balance over time, you know, it's sort of like education and advocacy needs to be happening in parallel to somehow, you know, help support the need for more of these systems. Every time a project goes by without building as much capacity as possible, we're, you know, reducing the chances of increasing flood capacity in the city of Boston. Every building that's built without a green roof, we lose a chance to, you know, have an inch or 2 or 3 absorbed. Instead, it's going directly to the storm drain systems that can't handle it. So, you know, it's a challenge. Oh, we might have hit our time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we're at the end of time. We've been seeing some folks along the way. I've actually got to get to another meeting, but I wanted to just say thanks to everyone for joining. Keep an eye out for future meetings, and if you've got ideas or things you want to share with us, let us know, and we can work with you on maybe giving a presentation with us too. So keep that in mind. I don't know, Eric, do you have any comments you want to make?
Just organizationally, I reposted all the links that we posted at the beginning, just in case some folks joined late. As Gary said, reach out to the group if you'd like to become more involved or want to contribute to the case studies. That's it.
And join us on LinkedIn. We have a LinkedIn page
that's
for those
right.
of you who are not active.
Yes,
One
yeah,
more thing.
that's a great way to stay in contact as well.
Thing that hopefully we talked about in the near future is that the BSA convention is going to be the AIA convention is going to be in Boston next year. And they right now have a call out for tours. It would be great if this group could put together a green roof tour for Boston-based buildings.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I agree.
Wonderful.
All right, I'm gonna jump off.
Thanks,
a lot.
everyone.
Nicole.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Nicole.
Nicole.
Everyone.
Great
Much.
talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me give the civil engineer's perspective.
That was wonderful.
Great.
I love it.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye. Yep, we'll talk to you soon.